guest speaker, we have Harry Fine. And once again, Harry Fine is the was appointed as an adjudicator at the Landlord and Tenant Board.
Your favorite place.
Yes, and president over hearing from 2001 to 2004. Instead of me going through his spiel, he could actually introduce himself.
I'm going to tell you about myself.
Yeah, and then we could go into Q&A and
okay, no
we'll
problem.
go from there.
I'm not sure if music is on in here or if it's just the door. Oh, okay. So good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here. I appreciate Maria, the other Maria, for inviting me. I'm sorry she's not here. And thank you, Maria, for making me feel so welcome. I'm going to give you a lot of information about the RTA, where it's been, where it's going, why it's going there, the LTV, etc. I am very good at what I do. I have, for 17 years, lived every day with the RTA and the LTB and become really Ontario's most respected paralegal for landlord-tenant stuff. In fact, the Law Society every year issues a series of awards. You can look up the Law Society website. And this year I was honored to receive the only award for paralegals called the William P. Simpson Award for Distinguished Paralegal of the Year. So I just found out about that about 3 weeks ago. But I'm a senior paralegal, but a very senior person in the landlord-tenant area. And it started when we sold our family business in 2000, and through weird circumstances, I ended up being an adjudicator at the Landlord and Tenant Board. I had never heard of the Landlord-Tenant Board in 2000. I had never heard of an administrative tribunal. I didn't know the government had agencies, boards, and commissions with appointed adjudicators. But I had a good friend who was the Attorney General at the time, and he said, "Harry, you're smart, you'd be good at this." So I went to the Landlord-Tenant Board as an appointee, learned the law, I learned about the RTA, the Residential Tenancies Act. It wasn't called that then. I learned about property law and contract law, and the government helped me learn a lot of stuff. And I served a term at the LTB, and I loved every day of it. And unfortunately, or actually fortunately, appointments to tribunals and boards and commissions, they're term limited. And there was an election in 2003. That's when Dalton McGuinty and the Liberals were first elected after a long period out of office. They'd been 9 years out of office, and they decided they were going to replace all their appointees with Liberal appointees once their terms came up. So November 2014, my term at the LTB as an adjudicator came up, and I, along with others, were replaced by good Liberals, some of whom are still there, so many years later. It's 2004, so like 14 years later. So I became a paralegal. They were just starting paralegal licensing in Ontario. Prior to 2007, you could just say, "I'm a paralegal," like you could just say, "I'm a sex therapist." Well, we did the same work, really. There's no requirements to be a therapist. You can put a shingle on the door, call yourself a therapist. There's no regulation. You can't call yourself a doctor or a dentist or a lawyer, but you could call yourself, prior to 2007, a paralegal. But the government knew there were lots of unscrupulous, incompetent paralegals. So after many decades of trying, they regulated paralegals and put us under the authority of the Law Society. So the Law Society is my regulator, just like the Law Society regulates lawyers. They now regulate paralegals as well. So I became a paralegal, and obviously I did a lot of landlord-tenant law because I was an adjudicator. It was easy for me because I knew the law, like better than anybody. But it was also easy because all these landlords out there, they knew me. They'd seen me at the Landlord-Tenant Board. They'd been in front of me, and either I made them happy or I made them sad with my decision, but they knew me. And I was respected there. So I got clients easily and built up a big paralegal business. In 2012, I started to do a little teaching on the side, teaching at Humber College to paralegals who are getting licensed as paralegals. Actually, I taught at real estate boards from the day I left the landlord-tenant board. So 2005 till today, I've probably taught at every real estate board across the province. I've taught at a lot of real estate offices, brokerages, and I was approved by Rekrut, the Real Estate Council of Ontario, as one of their presenters. And I really got to know a lot of realtors and investors and small landlords through my Rekrut training. Realtors were a good market for me because realtors needed to know something. Realtors needed to know something about landlord-tenant law. Realtors were often helping their clients get their house back, and they were often having problems. So realtors wanted to know, how do I raise the rent? How do I evict a tenant when we want to sell the house? Stuff like that. So I've been working with realtors since 2005, and in fact, in this last 10 days, I think I was at a realtor's office, 2 days ago in Toronto. I was in one in Richmond Hill. I was in one in Ajax. That's in the last maybe 10 days. And I have a lot of bookings because there's changes coming, as I'll tell you about, and realtors want to know about it. So I come to their office, they pay me, and I make sure that they're competent. I provide them lots of materials and help them advise their clients. April 30th, there's a whole whack of things happening that are connected to the changes that were introduced last year. So anyways, that's what I do. I'm a paralegal, although I've cut down on my paralegal practice because litigation is hard. Litigation is adversarial, always. It's stressful. A lot of paralegals and lawyers, they drink. There's a high suicide rate. You're always fighting somebody. And I far prefer my teaching. And so now I have a bit of both, which is great. I actually found this wonderful market of Chinese landlords. There are tens of thousands of Chinese landlords in the GTA. And they found me. And I now do a education session. I'm on my third semester through where we do 10 weeks of training. What is it? It's 2 hours? I forget, 2 or 3 hours, 10 weeks to teach them just about everything they need to know to stay out of trouble. Because if you come from mainland China and you're first generation here, all you know is that it's easy to have a tenant. You can take all the money up front. If they don't pay, you can kick them out, and the tenant has to do all the work. So they come here, and they get a reputation as being bad landlords because that's where they came from. But some of them realize they have to stay out of trouble. So they found me and hired me, and I've had the best time teaching my Chinese landlord group. Now for the third year, there's no tests, there's no exams to mark, no assignments to read. It's wonderful. Far more fun than teaching my Humber students who are entitled millennials. Poking at you there. So what do I know that can help you? The residential landlord-tenant law is very political and very complicated. And like it or not, you have to deal with it and you have to learn about it. Almost every residential tenancy in Ontario is governed by the RTA. When I say RTA, I mean the Residential Tenancies Act. I can't tell you how many investors, landlords, unfortunately, realtors. How many realtors are here? Okay, I'll be careful about what I say. How many people say, oh, I know the law, I know the Landlord-Tenant Act. Well, when did the Landlord-Tenant Act last exist? Anyone know? 98, you're damn close. 1998. After that was the Tenant Protection Act, June 18th, 1998. And in January 31st, 2007, came the RTA. New government comes in, new policies, changes. Today you live under the RTA. Landlord-Tenant Act doesn't exist. Maria, it's on a screensaver, so I'm not sure if that means it's still shooting, but as long as it's still shooting, that's great. So the RTA governs landlord-tenant residential relationships, and when you have a dispute, you go to the LTB, where I used to be an adjudicator. The LTB is called the Landlord-Tenant Board. It's one of hundreds of quasi-judicial adjudicative agencies in Ontario. There are a few tenancies not governed by the RTA. If the tenant's required to share a kitchen or a bathroom with you, the RTA does not apply. You can make any deal, kick them out, raise your rent, whatever. If you have a short-term rental, and it's not defined in the RTA as short-term, and some people are very confused about this. They say, I don't get it. I hear about the new Airbnb laws in Toronto, July 1st, and I'm trying to figure out, with the Airbnb laws, is that a short-term rental? Am I exempt from the RTA? And one of the problems people have is they're trying to match up the provincial RTA with their municipal bylaw. And they don't really match up. They may overlap in some points, but they may not. The City of Toronto, with their new bylaw, is saying that if it's on Airbnb, it's only in your principal residence, can't use a secondary suite in your home, which I found shocking. And everybody is going to go underneath the law come July 1st. If they have to move off Airbnb, they will. They'll go to Kijiji, whatever. There's a 4% hotel tax that just became law for tenancies under 30 days. So if you're a landlord providing accommodation, including the Airbnbs, they're going to charge them 4%. So people say, well, does that exempt me from the RTA? Well, probably, because they're staying for a weekend or a week. But if you rent it to somebody on Airbnb and you rent it to them for a year, it's probably covered by the RTA. Because the RTA doesn't look at, is it an Airbnb? The RTA looks at basically how long they're there for. How much does it look and smell like a long-term residential tenancy? So you can call it a bed and breakfast, for instance. And there's some cases that have gone to the courts where a landlord ran a bed and breakfast, but there was one guy who just loved the place, and she let him stay there forever. And finally, he didn't pay rent. She told him to get out. He said, no, I'm covered by the RTA. And they went to court, and she said, this is a bed and breakfast. And the court said, we don't care. It doesn't matter what you call it. It matters what it is. It matters whether or not you change the sheets and give them soap and check them in. And if they pay by the week or by the night or whatever it is, those things all matter to make it exempt from the RTA. Yes, the RTA is clear that short-term accommodation for the vacationing and traveling public is exempt. But then you get into some middle ground, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, and the RTA simply says short-term occupation for the vacationing or traveling public. So normally Airbnb, VRBO, it's going to be exempt because it is short-term, but not necessarily. So what's exempt? Student rentals in residences are exempt. Sharing kitchen or a bathroom, kitchen or a bathroom with the landlord or a member of the landlord's family is exempt. Short-term rentals are exempt. If it's a jail that you're living in, it's exempt. Hospitals exempt. A couple of other minor exemptions, but basically, unless you're running a vacation rental, an Airbnb, the RTA applies. So let's start there. The RTA applies, and there's nothing you can do about it. You have to live under it, whether you like it or not, and the RTA is a very political document. It changes from time to time. The RTA does 4 or 5 things. It creates certainty as to what the rights and obligations of landlord and tenant are. The biggie, it does rent control. If I could get a glass of water, I'd love it at some point. It does rent control. It creates rules for security of tenure for tenants so that tenants know that, thank you, tenants know that they won't have to move. It creates a system where if you want to evict, it creates a very complicated system. How many people have been to the LTB for eviction applications? A whole bunch. It creates a system, but you have to do it perfectly, because if you don't, you'll fail. It creates the landlord-tenant board. The RTA creates the landlord-tenant board and gives adjudicators power. And finally, the RTA makes our lives miserable. People blame the landlord-tenant board sometimes. They come back screaming and yelling, I lost today, that idiot adjudicator, or they use words worse than that. Sometimes the adjudicator deserves it. Most times it's not the adjudicator, it's your MPP, it's the provincial government. People ask me how we got here. how it got to be so bad. I try not to be too political, but I try to be factual. If we've voted for governments, small l liberal, governments of the left, things have just gotten worse and worse and worse. Governments see landlords as an easy target. Nobody loves the landlord. There's more tenants than landlords. If Doug Ford wins on behalf of the Conservatives in June the 7th, I'm not even sure things will change. Because landlords, tenanting, landlording, it's a populist issue. And they don't want to be in the paper every day. I worry about, I don't know how it's going to change until people stop providing rentals. So people in Toronto have said, no more of this crap with long-term RTA rentals. I'm going to have Airbnbs. Well, that's why the city brought in their bylaw. The city specifically brought in the bylaw because left-wing councillors in Toronto said, oh, we're not going to let them go there. We're going to plug that hole. It's crazy when governments get into controlling markets. When the governments make it more difficult for landlords, rents go up. Rents go up because landlords need more of a hedge against the cost it takes to evict, the cost of licensing. Like, who do they think is paying this? And certainly, if people get out of the business, rents go up because there's less supply. So it's a sad state as far as I'm concerned. And I blame politicians. In some ways, I blame landlords and big landlords groups. I blame some of the big stakeholders like AREA. The Ontario Real Estate Association has a big stake in making sure that the rules for renting are favorable to landlords, but they haven't complained about it. They haven't lobbied. There have been people like me, like voices in the wilderness, that lobby the government, but government doesn't care about me or you. They care about the tenant votes. So I'm going to talk today about some of the recent changes, now that I've given you sort of a background of where we are and what the Landlord-Tenant Board is. I should plug myself a little bit. I do litigation work, but only for some old, small clients. I do a lot of teaching to realtors' offices in the GTA mostly, but I do go elsewhere from time to time. As you're going to hear, there's lots of changes for the real estate industry coming, caused by the RTA changes. So if anybody's interested in having me come to their office, we can certainly set up a time. I also have the best, bar none, series of on-demand, 8 on-demand webinars that can turn a new investor or a property management company staff into experts. Not experts like me, but really damn good experts. Starting a tenancy, rent control, evictions for conduct, evictions for rent arrears, evictions for landlord's own use, attending the tribunal, stuff like that. They're 2 hours long, recorded video, audio, lots of forms and templates and precedents that I include along with it, along with a copy of the PowerPoint. They're dirt cheap, but some landlords are so cheap, it's unbelievable. It's the only business I know where too often the customer knows more than the business owner. Too many people run their business like a hobby, and you can run a hobby like a business, but you can't run a business like a hobby. Anybody who decides they're going to take their $600,000 property and not watch my videos to stay out of trouble, they're out of their minds, but that's their problem, not mine. If you know people that need some education, certainly send them my website. I started doing them live. I started this just in January. I thought, this is going to be fun. I'm going to do some webinars. And I did them live every Saturday for 8 weeks. And as I recorded them, they're now on-demand webinars. So they're interactive. People are asking me questions, things like that. In fact, there's actually 7 recorded. The 8th one is this Saturday, and then I'll have the full 8-pack. I used to sell 6 when I'd done 6 as a 6-pack. Sounded good. Now I don't know what to call it. It's an 8-pack, but that doesn't do it. So what's happened recently? What are the recent changes? You've heard about leases and marijuana, which isn't particularly a provincial government change. That's a Justin Trudeau gift from the federal government. But let me start with changes to the RTA in 2017. It started with a government that's low in the polls, Kathleen Wynne, excuse me. And there was a young woman, millennial, who worked for CBC named Shannon, not Miller. I told you guys the name before, it finally came to me. Shannon somebody. She worked for CBC. She lived downtown Toronto. Single, no kids, so she could live the life. She was working, paying her rent, clubs, partying. It's a good life being 25 and single in downtown Toronto. I wish I was there again. And then her landlord doubled her rent. So she went crazy, and she thought, I have a voice. I work for the CBC. So Shannon started doing a series on rent control in Ontario. She embarrassed the government. The embarrassment was because there was a rule since 1991, which continued in 95 when the provincial Conservatives created the Tenant Protection Act, 98, sorry, that any property built after November 1991 didn't have to follow the rent control guideline. Nobody knew about it. Honestly, how many of you knew about it? The reason people didn't know about it is because the tenant groups didn't yell and scream about it because they were angry that there was all these exempt properties. But they didn't yell and scream because they knew a lot of you didn't know. And if they started to yell and scream, you'd double the rent. Landlord groups didn't talk about it much because if they stuck it in your face, they knew the government would be in trouble and have to change the rules. So everybody lived very quietly since 91, 25 years, 26 years, with properties built, houses or condos, after November 91 were exempt from the provincial guideline that the government establishes every year based on the Consumer Price Index to set the next year's rent control maximum. So Shannon wrote the stories. Toronto, of course, is full of condos. Almost every condo is built post-91. So, and the condo boom's been amazing. If you look like, let's say 15 years ago, maybe 2% of Toronto's units were not controlled by rent control. Come 2017, probably 15% are not rent controlled because of all the building that's happened. So Shannon writes the story, and the provincial government is embarrassed. Kathleen Wynne sees an election coming up and sees this large group of tenants. So the Wynne government introduced a bill on April 27, 2017, called the Rental Fairness Act. The big part of it was the exemption, the rent control exemption, to close that loophole so that everybody, new condos, new houses, everybody would be subject to the guideline. But while they were doing it, they thought they'd put some more things in there, I'm trying to control myself, that aggravate landlords and make our lives more difficult. And I'm going to tell you what those changes were. The law was, it became law, it was passed later, and parts of the law came into effect on September 1st, 97, and some parts actually came into force on January 1st, 2018. But one part, the rent control, was enacted retroactive to April 20th, 1997. So if you hadn't given your tenant the exempt notice of rent increase by the 19th midnight, and nobody knew it was coming, they made it retroactive to April 20th. So starting, any rent increases starting April 20th had to be just, what was last year? Anybody know?
1.7.
1.5 last year. 1.8 this year. Landlords in Toronto, with all the condos, were furious. They bought properties expecting a positive cash flow, and all of a sudden, all these condo increases, and lately, because of the minimum wage and other reasons, condo fees are going way up. Like this year, I'm hearing like a lot of my neighbors and stuff are having 8% increases, and yet you can raise the rent 1.8%. Some condos have special assessments if their reserve fund is low. You can't compensate for it. You can't raise the rent except 1.8%. I heard some stories, and this is sad. of landlords who had bought pre-construction, finally got the condo in what's called the interim occupancy period. They don't own it yet, but the condo's occupied. Right away, they want to start making money, so they rented out Maria a unit, and they said, Maria, this is a $2,300 unit. We're going to give it to you for $1,800 for the first year. That's what we'll sign the lease for, because there's no pool, there's no sauna, there's no gym, they're still working on the upper floors. One of the elevators is being used by the tradespeople. And by the way, that's what happens when you move into a new condo in Toronto. You move in when it's half finished. So Maria, it's $1,800, but just so you know, I can raise the rent whatever I want. This is exempt. So next year, it'll probably be like $2,300. So Maria thinks that's great, that's fair. What a nice person. They didn't try to gouge me first year. They sign the lease. April 20th comes, locked in. That landlord is stuck at $1,800 forever, plus the guideline increase of 1.8. Completely unfair. No rules for grandfathering and transition. It's just the craziest thing. So now, with the elimination of the exemption for post-91 buildings, it's actually raised rents for everybody. Because if I'm going to rent now to Maria, and I'm thinking, boy, all I can raise is the guideline, I got to make sure I set my rent extra high in case I have condo fee increases or a special assessment. And of course, people will stop investing in condos, so then you'll have fewer condos built, fewer for rent, and that will raise prices as well. So everything the Wynne government has done was political. It was designed to get the vote of the tenant population, which is much bigger than the landlord population, in the hopes of winning the election. Look, just this week, yesterday it was free child care before nursery school. A couple of weeks ago it was dental, free dental. A couple of months ago it was free drugs for those 25 and under. I mean, she's giving away my children's future because she can't pay for it. I won't go further into that, but that's what she was doing with the changes to the RTA. So that was part of the Rental Fairness Act. Now, these condo owners or house owners who used to be exempt from the guideline have to figure out how to keep up. How do we stay positive cash flow? Well, easy, we have to shoot the tenant, but that's illegal. Because see, when you shoot the tenant, you can charge whatever you want for the next tenant. Because we have a system in Ontario of rent control that's technically called vacancy decontrol. There's different ways of rent control. You can have New York City where there's a registry of rents and a unit stays controlled even if somebody leaves. Dalton McGuinty promised that in the election of 2003. Thank goodness he broke that promise. And there's talk now by the poverty activists, the poverty industry, that now that they've got all these big wins in the Rental Fairness Act, they want to eliminate vacancy decontrol and bring back rent control. So when you leave and he moves in, the government knows the rent, he can look it up, and I can't raise it. But that's not the way it works today. We still fortunately have vacancy decontrol. So if I shoot my tenant, and there's no other tenants, then I can re-rent it and charge whatever the market will bear. And again, think of the GTA, things going up like crazy, even for condos still, even though houses have seen a dip. So I'd feel terrible if I rented to you for $2,200, and 2 years from now, that same unit across the hall, some landlord's getting $2,600. Like, how do I get rid of you? Well, I can't shoot you. So what do? I say I'm moving in, or my son's moving in, or a caregiver's moving in. So, as you can imagine, the number of landlords' own use applications skyrocketed because landlords needed a way to get rid of those tenants short of shooting them. So the government anticipated this, so they said, hey, we're going to make it harder to do a landlord's own use application. Landlord's own use applications at the LTB have always been controversial. A lot of them are fake. The adjudicators can't always prove they're fake, but they look at them with a lot of skepticism. And if you go to the board to evict because you're moving in, or your family's taking over the basement, or your son's moving in, or you've sold to a purchaser, and he says he's moving in, and that's called a purchaser's own use application. There's landlord's own use applications or a purchaser's own use application. Same notice, same application. But the board is pretty skeptical because they know a lot of them are crap. So they changed the RTA to make it even to use the landlord's own use and purchaser's own use process. Unfortunately, a lot of landlords are sold a bill of goods and told that it's easy to evict by saying you're wanting to move in. I've sort of always joked about it, called it the hairdresser problem. Like you go to your hairdresser and you're telling them everything, particularly women tell their hairdresser everything, and you're talking about the stupid, shitty tenant, and you really love to get rid of him, and they say, oh, don't worry, just say your son's moving in. Hey, that sounds great, but it's wrong. It's so wrong because the problems you can get into are unbelievable, worse now than they used to be. If you're found to have given notice in bad faith and the tenant moves out, the tenant can sue you with an application at the LTB and get up to 12 months of increased rent that they had to pay. So if they're paying $400 bucks a month more, it's $4,800, which isn't the end of the world. They can get all their moving and storage costs back. They can get a further abatement of rent. But really, we're not talking the end of the world. So the law didn't stop there. They can fine you up to $25,000 at the LTB. So you can get really slammed at the LTB if you give bad faith notice, the tenant moves out, the tenant drives by your house and sees a for sale sign on or sees a new tenant down there instead of the landlord, you're in some trouble. It's actually worse than that because if you went to a hearing, so I gave Maria the N12 notice, but she says, I don't believe you. So I have to file an application to the board. So I file the application, I go to the hearing in front of the adjudicator. I bring my wife, my children, and I convince the adjudicator that my son is moving in. But the adjudicator is not allowed to evict on this notice, this application, unless the person who's moving in, who says they're moving in, swears it on an affidavit. So my son, he's the one, who said he's moving in, and my son swears the affidavit. Then he doesn't move in. It's a provincial offense, nothing to do with the RTA. It's a provincial offense to give a false or misleading document to the board. So once the tenant wins on his T5 application, and you've been slammed there, he can call the Ministry of Housing, give them a copy of the LTB order. They can prosecute you in provincial offenses court. And upon conviction, you can be fined another $25,000. So false N12s, bad faith notices, are not the solution to anything. I mean, they're the start of the problem. Yes, you get away with it a lot, but it's problematic. But the government wanted to make it tougher, so here's what they did. And by the way, I have a good PowerPoint that I did when these changes were made, because I've spoken to a lot of groups, but we didn't have a projector here. Usually I go to places where they have the PowerPoint projector. So I'm going to email them to Maria. Actually, maybe I'll just upload them to the as a file to the group, because a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about today with the changes is going to be there. So I'll do my best to remember most of this stuff as I'm telling you now. So they changed the landlord's own use applications in a number of ways. First of all, if you give the tenant an N12, so Maria, you have to move out. You've been a great tenant, but my son's moving in. I have to give her, by the termination date in the notice, 1 month's rent. Now that's not the end of the world, because if you're really getting your house back like forever, it's a month's rent. So suck it up. I don't really have a huge issue with that, but I'll tell you, when the rent starts to be $3,000 or $4,000 a month on some expensive places, it is a lot of money. And when you give the tenant the N12 and they agree to move, they can give you 10 days notice. So potentially, and I had this happen to a neighbor of mine in my building. She was paying $2,000 a month. So the landlord says to her, Amy, my daughter's moving in. Amy's smart. She said, give me an N12 if your daughter's moving in. This was after the changes. So the landlord gave her the N12 because he had no choice. That triggered the obligation to pay 1 month's rent. So he says, okay, here it is. She said, I'm leaving, here's my notice to move out, I'm leaving in 10 days. So she left the 24th of October. She paid October's rent, but she still had an LMR on deposit. So he had to give her back $2,000 as compensation because he'd used the N12, return the LMR of $2,000, which is $4,000, and pay her for the last 6 days of rent because she was able to give notice to that period. He paid like, $4,300. Amy lived right beside me in my condo. Has anybody moved in yet? No. Very interesting. I think now he's afraid because he learned that she knows her rights. Now if he moves a tenant in, he's in big trouble. But we'll get there in a few minutes. So they changed the law so you have to give them 1 month's compensation. They also changed the law so that corporate landlords, that is a landlord owned by an Ontario corporation or federal corporation, cannot evict a tenant for landlord's own use. So if you and your spouse opened a company and you signed a lease with Maria, and the lease was in the name of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 Ontario Limited, and then 3 years later you genuinely wanted to move back into the house, you couldn't. You couldn't evict her because they changed the law. You could before the change in the Rental Fairness Act, but you can't now. So they sure made it tougher. They changed some other rules. If you give notice and the tenant leaves, and it's found that you didn't move in, or you re-advertised, or re-rented, or advertised for sale, the law says you are now deemed to have given bad faith notice. Now the tenant can sue you with the T5 and try to get that compensation and the fine, but the difference now is you're already deemed to have given bad faith notice. The onus is on you, the landlord, or what we call the respondents to the application, to prove you didn't give bad faith notice. The way it used to be before the Rental Fairness Act is Maria moved out, then she sued me afterwards. She would have to prove bad faith. How do you prove my bad faith? Now, I have to prove good faith. So tenants that get sued with landlord's own use applications are going to have a much, much harder time. It's going to be very complicated with this compensation stuff because if I have a tenant in the basement and I want him out, and let's pretend for the moment that I really am going to use the whole house for myself. I'm living upstairs. My kids are getting older. I want the whole house. So I'm going down and I'm going to give Maria the N12 and I know I'm going to have to give her that compensation. And I start thinking to myself, I wonder if Maria knows about this compensation stuff. So I put the N12 in my back pocket and I say, how you doing, Maria? Nice to see you. Maria, you know my kids here. You've seen them grow up. Well, they're getting older, Maria, and we're going to have to ask you to leave because we need the whole house. But Maria, I'm going to give you $500, $800 to cover your expenses. Maria doesn't know about compensation. Landlord hasn't given her the N12. Maria says, okay. Can I have another month, says Maria? Fine, we'll make it June 30th. Deal? Let's sign this N11 agreement to move out for June 30th. So she signs it and she goes. She finds out I re-rented the basement. And she never got the compensation when I should have given her the N12, but I kept it in my back pocket. So she now wants two things. She wants the compensation because I should have given the N12, which would have triggered the obligation to pay compensation. And she wants to sue me for bad faith notice. But for either of those things to succeed in her application, I must have given her an N12. I didn't. So what's the Landlord-Tenant Board going to do when the landlords acted badly, intentionally didn't give her the N12, told her that his son was moving in bad faith? The board's going to find a way to punish the landlord. So if you think that you have an edge by simply not using the N12, giving her half what you have to give her, and then hoping she signs the N11, it might work. But I think the first time that tenant signs or files an application on that basis to the LTB will find a way to order the compensation. I know how I would do it as an adjudicator. I know how I would find the legal authority to give her her money, even though the landlord never gave her the N12. And if I know it, so does the LTB. So be very careful. You really can't get away without compensation. The Act says you have to give her compensation by the termination date in the notice. So let's say I give her the notice today, and if she pays rent the first of the month, and I gave her the notice today, the earliest the termination date could be would be May 31st. 60 days, last day of a rental period. So Maria, you got to be out by May 31st. She says no. What do you do if the tenant says, I'm not signing the N11, I'm not leaving? What do you do? File the L2. So the next day I file the application to go to the board. But my hearing is on June the 6th. The law says I have to pay her compensation by the termination date in the N12. So by May 31st, I make sure I've paid her $2,000 equivalent to 1 month rent. June the 6th, we have our hearing. We go to the adjudicator. The adjudicator doesn't believe me. He denies my application to evict. But, Mr. Chair, she has my money. The board, it says in the new act, the revised act, that if the landlord pays compensation and the board refuses to grant the application, listen to this, it says the board may order the compensation be returned. What? So you mean I could pay her, she doesn't move, we go to a hearing, the board denies my application, she can keep my money? Why did the government write it as may order her to return it? So let's say the adjudicator seems like a smart guy. He orders her to return it. What if she doesn't? He issues an order, the adjudicator, denies my eviction application, not believing that I want to move in, but orders her to repay it, and she doesn't. How do I get it back? You would think that you could just say, well, now she owes, the adjudicator ordered her to give it back, therefore she's behind a month in rent. I can just give her an N4. The problem is, another very strange thing in the legislation, they called that 1 month I give her 1 month of compensation. They didn't call it rent. So when the adjudicator kindly orders her to repay me the compensation, it's not rent. There's no way for me to sue her at the LTB for compensation. I would have to go to small claims court. So I file at small claims court trying to enforce this judgment of $2,000 with the small claims court deputy judge. I don't know how many of you have been to small claims court on landlord-tenant issues. A lot of the time they simply say, this isn't our issue, go to the landlord-tenant board. But wait a minute, the landlord-tenant board doesn't deal with this compensation, it's not rent. They say, well, neither do we. It's a landlord-tenant board issue. So they wrote this, it seems to me, in a way to intentionally screw landlords. I try to give them the benefit of the doubt. I'm good at what I do. I can read into what they've done. I can look at it and say, is there a reason they've done this? Is it some logical reason? But there's none. They have made it so that money that you have to pay, you might have a tough time getting it back if the board doesn't evict the tenant. So that's the bad news on landlord's own use applications. They did some other minor things I won't mention, but they did, the third big thing they did was they created a structure for standard lease forms to be used by all landlords throughout Ontario. In a way, I don't blame them for doing it because there were so many illegal leases. The most important clause, if I had 1 minute to teach you about the RTA, what I would teach you is that Section 3 of the RTA says that the Act applies regardless of any waivers or agreements to the contrary. In other words, you can't contract out of the Act. So for instance, if we agree to a rent increase more than the guideline, it's illegal. If we agree to a rent increase without an N1, it's illegal. If we agree that you can come in, landlord, and fix my sink whenever you get a plumber in, it's illegal. Because the Act talks about rent increases, and the Act talks about notice of entry. If we agree, I'm talking to realtors here, that the tenant will pay the first $100 of appliance repair, it's illegal. If we agree that the tenant shall cut the grass and shovel the snow, it's illegal. All these things that for years people have been putting in leases violated the RTA. So the government got fed up. They said, we're going to make a lease so the tenants know their rights. What I thought they should have done was to create a one-page document telling tenants what the illegal clauses are. You don't have to move out at the end of the term. It becomes month to month. You don't have to do maintenance. You only have to pay more rent if there was a notice of rent increase. You're entitled to get interest every year on the rent deposit. Your landlord can only enter or be done. I could have written it in 10 minutes. But instead of doing a one-pager, the government decided that you have to attach to your lease. The government decided to do a whole new lease. So they spent a lot of money on consultants and lawyers, and they drafted a new standard mandatory lease that everybody, landlords, small landlords, landlords through realtors, landlords in apartment buildings, landlords everywhere have to use. Now, the truth is, you're not required to use it unless you have a written lease. There is no law in Ontario that says, you must have a written tenancy agreement. But you can't not have a written tenancy agreement. You'd be out of your mind not to. Some unsophisticated landlords think, well, if I don't have a written lease, it's easier to kick out the tenant. Well, they say that because they don't understand that even without a written lease, there's an agreement. There's a verbal agreement or an implied agreement, and all those things created a tenancy. If there's nothing in writing, how are you going to prove what the rent was, what the deposit was, how many parking spots they're entitled to, who the tenants are? You can't not have a lease. Now, one of the reasons landlords, small landlords say, I'm not going to have a lease, is because they misunderstand the word lease. You're a sophisticated group. You're people that are doing this stuff, you're learning, so you're not going to be as bad as the regular group I talk to. But in some groups I talk to, most people in the group don't understand that at the end of the lease term, nothing happens. They think that a lease means somehow you have no commitment. They confuse term with tenancy. They apply the last month's rent deposit to the last month of the term. They do everything wrong. So some landlords, they hear, I don't want to have a lease. They think that just means I don't want to have term. A lot of landlords confuse lease with term. They say, I'm not going to have a lease, so I'm going to be month to month. It's like saying, I don't want to have a wife, I want to have a Chrysler. Probably a good trade. Sorry, women, sorry. Me too, yeah. Sorry. So we can edit this afterwards. So a lease is simply a piece of paper. If you had a tenancy with no written agreement, you don't need the standard government agreement. But if you have a written tenancy agreement, it has to be the standard government form. You have no choice. The government introduced the form about a month ago, but it comes into effect April 30th. Any tenancy agreement you sign from April 30th afterwards has to be on the standard government form. You have no choice. The standard government form is, you know where to get it. You've seen it, I assume, or you know about it. Maybe not. One of the good places, if you want a recap of this and links to some of the forms, etc., if you go to my blog, if you go to hfineparalegal.ca, which is my website, and then click on Blogger, I think 3 of the last 4 blog posts I wrote were about the standard lease, stuff like that. So the one that says Standard Lease is coming to Ontario has some links to the government document, so you can get it there. So you have to download this document, which you can, it's a PDF, you can edit it as a PDF. Well, a lot of people had problems with it, particularly those with Apple's, Macs. So it's the law, you have to use it, you can't use anything else. Realtors have had a real issue because OREA has given no guidance. Their boards have given no guidance. In many cases, their brokerage has not given their salespeople guidance. And they're wondering, what do we do? Because realtors use this Form 400, which is an offer to lease for decades, I think, an offer to lease that once accepted turns into the agreement. In other words, it's only one document that has the lease conditions and terms, but it's also used as an offer document. I won't get into realtor leasing, although one of my blog posts is about the Form 400 and some of my thoughts on realtor leasing. So if you're a realtor, you might want to go there and take a read. So realtors are wondering, what do we do? Nobody's given us the new Form 400. Nobody's told us if we have to use the government form. Well, realtors have to use the government form. So OREA finally, about a week ago, put out the new Form 400. You've all probably seen it if you've had a realtor act for you in a leasing situation. But the difference now is that the Form 400 is only the offer to lease. And then once the landlord agrees, I'm going to take you as a tenant, we go over here and we sign the standard government lease document. In effect, the offer to lease, the new Form 400, has no, it dies really once it's accepted and you sign the new government document. Whether it's a realtor doing the government lease or whether it's a small landlord or big landlord doing the government lease, the problem is that the government lease sucks. And it sucks for a number of reasons. First of all, it's 13 pages, which is not the problem. My lease is like 22 pages. The problem is the first 6 pages of the 13 are the lease with the conditions and terms, things you fill in, signatures. And the next 7 pages are instructions telling the tenant what each section means. But you have to give the tenant the whole 13 pages. So now the tenant's going to know they don't have to shovel the snow and cut the grass. They don't have to pay for appliance repair. They're entitled to get interest on the LMR. You can only enter with notice. The tenancy doesn't end at the end of the term, etc. You can only raise the rent by the guideline, etc. So right away, this lease provides the tenant with lots of information. Just as bad, the lease is a skeleton, really badly drafted. It's designed, and I was thinking like 6 months ago when I heard of this, how are they going to create a lease that fits every situation? Condos, farmhouses, shared duplexes, triplexes, single-family homes, apartment buildings. How in the world are they going to create that in one lease? Well, now I know how they did it. They just kept everything that would make it specific to a type of tenancy out. So all it is really is party names, rent, commencement date, rent deposit, discounts if any, is it in a condo, tick this box. Almost nothing else except instructions, signatures. So the question is, where's all the other stuff that makes your lease particular to your situation? I'll answer this because there's some realtors here, differently for realtors as for small landlords. Either way, you're going to have some particulars. If a realtor did it, then I would think those things that should be particular to small landlords should be, just as they were copied and pasted into the Form 400, should be copied into a document that you could call Appendix A and attached to the government lease form. Some realtors have said, can't we just attach the 400A as the appendix? I suppose you can. I don't like it for a number of reasons. Some realtors' offices have asked me the craziest things. They've said to me, the brokers phoned me and said, Harry, who should fill out the government lease? Imagine, you're paying the commission to the realtor to do the offer, to find you the tenant, to do the credit checks, whatever. Often, and realtors will all agree with me, you get people with lots of money and little sophistication. So you really can't say, congratulations, you've got your tenant, here's this lease, fill it out, good luck. So some realtors thought that's a no-brainer. Of course we've got to do it, that's our job. Some realtors were saying, Harry, can we get the landlord to do the government lease? No. No, you shouldn't, you can't. You can do whatever you want, but you certainly shouldn't. But you need some sort of addendum appendix to attach. Now, the only good thing about the new government lease is that it says in section 15 that a landlord can add an appendix with their own terms. So you can customize it to your tenancy. But it's very clear you can only add terms that are legal. Excuse me. So realtors, you could take an appendix form. It doesn't have to be an official AREA form. It could just say appendix B. And why would it be B? Because A is the last 7 pages. There's the lease at 6 pages, then the government appendix that you got to attach to it. So our first appendix would be appendix B. So all you need is a document that says appendix B, additional clauses, and it's part of the lease. It's no big deal. Small landlords, you need to do the same thing. I mean, you need to have an appendix that has the clauses you need. Every appendix will be different. And I'm going to take a few minutes, not too many, to talk about why you need a good appendix. Boy, I could talk an hour on this. Condos need clauses that regular homes don't. Homes where you have multiple people, but with shared spaces, like a backyard, because you've got an upstairs and downstairs tenant, needs clauses about exclusive use versus shared use areas so there's no confusion. People that are sharing laundry rooms up and down, you can use Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you can use Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, Sunday, no later than 10 o'clock. If you have parking, you need a load of parking terms. Oil changes, no. Licensed cars only, no RVs, only in your spot. Stuff like this. I got 3 paragraphs on cars if you allow parking. Utilities. There's 3 ways to charge for utilities. And the LTB doesn't look at utilities as rent. If you have all-in utilities, then you're not really charging for utilities. It's easy, but there's risks because if they run the water all day, it's your problem. If they bring in their friends or new occupants, it's your problem. You can have them contract directly with the utility company as part of the lease. Pretty good way to do it. Or in a house with multiple tenancies but 1 meter, you can have a clause in the lease about prorated share of utilities. But however you do it, you need well-written clauses to protect you. For instance, let's take the one about landlord pays, but you reimburse. Basement 40%, upstairs 60%. You might guess by now that I've written the world's best lease addendum to be used with the government lease. I have a full page with 3 different options depending on how you use utilities. And it'll say something like, gas, water, and hydro are included in the rent. However, the tenant's responsible to reimburse the landlord subject to the following conditions. 1, every blank days or months, the landlord will provide the tenant with a copy of a summary along with photocopies or electronic copies of the various bills to the end of that period. 2, the landlord will make a demand for the funds. 3, the tenant will reimburse within 10 days. 4, if the tenant doesn't reimburse within 10 days, the tenant is deemed to have substantially interfered with the landlord's lawful right, interest, and privilege under the RTA and can be evicted at the LTB. And furthermore, the landlord is entitled to recovery of the money at a court of competent jurisdiction, which will be small claims court. That's one way of doing utilities. Every one of my ways protects you. The things I've seen, the clauses I've seen by unsophisticated landlords. I've seen landlords write in, the tenant will pay the hydro for the lights. Or the tenant, or in cases where the tenant's going to reimburse the landlord, they just leave, they check the box, tenant's responsibility. But nothing about how it's to be done. You are not the lord of the land. You cannot change conditions unilaterally. You cannot just make it up as you go. The lease is important, and you short sell it. And realtors are the worst at short selling it, I'm sorry to say. They do up their Form 400, which is somewhat skeletal, and then it becomes the lease. I strongly encourage realtors and landlords, if you want to buy mine, I'm thrilled. I have a forms package that has, I just made some changes today, that has the best one in the province that will protect you every which way. Smoking, growing marijuana, pets, water, but you name it. It's in there, because I've been doing this for 18 years. And I used to have my own lease that I'd let my clients use. Now they can't use my lease anymore, so I've taken stuff out of it and created an appendix. It's a Word document. So you take it, I sell it to you with a package of other stuff, including a PowerPoint on evictions, but lots of other great forms you can use, guarantors forms and parking forms, and all sorts of stuff that really are good. And when you look at your house, you read my thing, and you cut and paste into an appendix, into a Word document, the things that work for you. You make the changes that you might need. Simple things like rent paid on behalf of someone other than the tenant are deemed to be paid by the tenant. I've seen so many cases where tenant moves in with a friend, been there for 5 years, he moves out, he says he's a tenant. I don't want him as a tenant, but he's paid rent a couple of times, and now the landlord-tenant board says, well, that makes him a tenant. Not if you use my lease, it doesn't. I have thought of everything. And if you can think of things I haven't, for instance, prepaid rent. You cannot collect a rent deposit of more than 1 month's rent. That's illegal. And they make that very clear in the government form. But there's some cases that have gone to the Ontario Divisional Court that say, if it's done right, you can charge prepaid rent. So if I have a tenant who seems great during the interview and the checking process, good job, but he's new to the country, so he has no credit, if he suggests it, that's what the case law says. So you seem like a great guy, but I'm really nervous because you got no credit history here. What can we do? What can we do? I'd like to rent to you. So he says, well, I'll pay you 6 months last month's rent up front. That's illegal. And he can get it back tomorrow by filing a T1. And if he does, he'll even get the 1 month. You'll have no deposit left. But what we can do is agree that you'll pay the first 6 months prepaid. So first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and last. You haven't broken the law about the LMR, and you're allowed to take prepaid rent. The courts have said he has to offer it. So my lease says there's a clause you can take out. It's in blue, which means you may want to delete it, change it. I've color-coded things. It says the tenant offered and the landlord has accepted 6 months of prepaid rent. That's a clause you want him to initial, because you want it to be very clear that he looked at that and he offered. So you need this stuff. You cannot go with a standard government lease without something. Realtors often use some clauses made by AREA, the Ontario Real Estate Association. You have standard AREA clauses. They're unbelievably bad. AREA's fault, not your fault. For instance, let me give you a great for instance, scare the heck out of you. I have seen lots of landlord-tenant board cases where the lease was done by a realtor using an AREA clause that says, providing that the tenancy is in good standing, the tenant may, within 60 days at the end of the lease term, renew at their option for an additional term. Sounds okay? First of all, term sucks. Term does nothing for you and everything for the tenant. You can't evict for own use during term. You can't evict for purchaser's use during term. You can't evict for demolition, conversion, change of use. You can't even evict for persistent late payment of rent during term. Term sucks. Take a year, but no more. But I've seen these AREA clauses that give the tenant the right to renew. But it's so badly written, here's what happens. Tenant is a great tenant, so in the 10th month, she gives me written notice she's going to renew. So now she's in term again. And the 10th month of the new term, she gives me written notice she wants to renew. And then finally, after a few years, I want my condo back for my son. So I say, I'm sorry, Maria, here's your N12. I'm terminating at the end of the term, but I can't because she's already given me her notice to renew term. The AREA clause allows a tenant to keep in perpetual term forever. Now, think about it. What do you have if your tenant has a right to live in your place for life? You no longer have a property as part of your investment mix. You have an annuity spinning off, hopefully, cash flow, but at a very tightly controlled rate of increase because you're subject to the guideline. You've lost your house. I would encourage realtors, and I've gone to so many offices now, they all use my form. They take my clauses and turn them into their clauses. Cutting and pasting. You know, that's all it takes. So please use something that protects you. Recognize that your lease may be different from your lease because every tenancy is a bit different. Recognize that you can't make it up as you go along. You're not the lord of the land and you can't change terms midway. So cover, how you take out garbage, where your guests can put, whatever it is, it's got to be in your lease. The last thing I want to talk about is the new marijuana laws. Not strictly related to residential tenancies, but it's going to affect us absolutely. The federal government changed the law so that marijuana is no longer illegal. You can use it. You can grow up to 4 plants per individual in a household. Is it 4 plants per household, not 4 plants per individual in a household? And the federal government passed it. The federal Senate passed it last week. And now the provinces are working hard to regulate it because the provinces are allowed to regulate it, where you can smoke. The city of, it's in Quebec, Hampstead, it's in Montreal. The city of Hampstead passed a bylaw saying that there's no smoking on the streets of Hampstead. Marijuana users are furious because Justin Trudeau gave them the right to smoke in public places, but the city of Hampstead passed a bylaw saying they couldn't. If Hampstead's small, if you want to smoke, go outside the limits. Every province has the right to regulate it. Just as the province passed a law years ago to require municipalities to allow secondary suites, they allowed cities to make the rules. And some cities, I hear, have dragged their butts because they don't want them. And they've been slow making up the rules. But anyways, the provinces are allowed to regulate. So in Ontario, we have 40 stores. We have the private market of the dispensaries eliminated. We have no rules because Premier Wynne doesn't want to piss off the tenants. We have no rules about using in rentals, whether growing or smoking. So what can you do? You need to have a great lease. If you look at the clauses in my lease, both about smoking, and it's about smoking anything, including vaping, including marijuana, or any substance that emits smoke. It's not about being judgmental. We don't like marijuana or potheads. I'm not judgmental about it. I love my wine, and I'm sure people that love their marijuana are just as nice as I am. I'm sure some of you are marijuana smokers. There you go. But you want to have no smoking for a lot of different reasons, whatever it is. Making the walls all yellow, bothering other tenants, increasing turnover costs, fire risks. Then there's the issue of growing marijuana plants. And again, it's in my lease appendix. Believe me, it's not in the government one. Growing is interesting because I'm hearing 2 sides of the story and I don't know enough about it. Some people are saying, as a tenant, why should you be able to stop me growing? It's just another plant. If I grow 4 plants, which is the law, it's just another plant. Some people say, and I don't know, marijuana plants are huge, and when they start to become ripe, they give off a really strong smell, and they require so much water, and you're going to get moisture and damage. I don't know which is true, but I know I have a clause that can prohibit it. And there's long prefaces to these clauses. Due to the dangers of secondhand smoke, due to the high turnover cost, due to this, the tenant agrees that. So how do you enforce it? First of all, by having your lease clauses. Now the tenant does it. You should be able to get easy evictions if you've got proper lease clauses initialed by tenants. First of all, understand that the LTB does not evict for conduct per se. They evict for how the conduct affects people. So for instance, you try to evict for prostitution. You find out that there's a prostitute living in one of your units. Some adjudicators will evict, some won't. If she's the world's most high-class prostitute, and there's no fights in the halls, there's no drug use, there's no people pushing all the buzzers to get into the building at 2 in the morning, the board will say, how is her behavior affecting the building? And if it's not, they won't evict. The same is very much true of most contractual conditions you put in your lease. You could have a clause that says the tenant must go to church every Sunday. Well, it's contractual, but the board won't evict because to evict, the N5 says, or the N7 if the landlord lives there with 3 units or less, that the landlord can evict for substantial interference with the reasonable enjoyment of the landlord, substantial interference with reasonable enjoyment of other tenants, or substantial interference with the landlord's lawful right, interest, and privilege. So, we sign a lease. You break the lease. You're interfering with my lawful right, substantially. For instance, you were supposed to pay utilities. You didn't pay them. I'm having to pay them. The LTB doesn't deal with utilities, but they deal with substantial interference with lawful rights. It's costing me an extra $150 a month out of my pocket. I don't evict you with an N4 for utilities because utilities aren't rent. I evict you with an N5 because you're substantially interfering with my lawful right. Same with marijuana, same with pets. I mean, you can't evict a tenant for pets just because there's pets, but you can evict them if in some way they're substantially interfering with the enjoyment of others, causing safety issues, biting somebody, leaving a mess in the yard, barking, allergies. So it's always about the consequence of the conduct on the building and people living in it that you'll get an eviction for. So how do I evict when they're growing plants? Well, sort of like the prostitute, if it's not hurting anybody, and the only way you knew they had marijuana plants was when you went in and happened to recognize them. No moisture, no tubing with water, no lights. The guy's growing a pot plant. You probably won't get an eviction because you're going to have to prove how it substantially interferes either with enjoyment or a lawful right. It's like the question of insurance. Can I evict if the tenant doesn't get insurance? Well, you'd have to prove that he substantially interfered with your lawful right, interest, and privilege. So if you could get a letter from your insurance company that says, an opinion letter that says, we will not insure against perils such when marijuana is grown or consumed in a unit. We're insuring you, landlord, for non-smoking tenants. Then you write a non-smoking lease. Then the tenant breaches it. You can't lose at the LTB. You bring evidence, that is the letter, or the insurance broker if he'll come. You bring evidence of the smoking, or the whatever it might be, the smoking or the grow up, whatever. If the tenant jeopardizes you with respect to the fire department, the health department, your insurance, municipal licensing. For instance, if you were running in Toronto, they allow rooming houses. Rooming houses are licensed. If I do the right things, I can get a rooming house, but they're covered by the RTA. If you're a tenant who's doing something so terrible that it's interfering with my right to get my rooming house license renewed, I can evict you. If I have a tenant in a condo and he's interfering with condo bylaws, it might not even be bothering me. I don't live in the condo. I'm renting the condo out. Might not even be bothering the other people in the condo, but the security guard saw him drinking beer and throwing a can from his balcony. Now, me, the owner of the condo, I'm going to get a letter from the property management company, or worse, I'm going to get a letter from the property management companies, or the condo corp's solicitors, warning me that my tenant's doing these things. And by the way, the solicitor for the corporation is going to charge about $600 for that letter because the PM doesn't care and the corp doesn't care because it gets charged back to my common element fees. There is no rationality of expense when there's chargebacks in condos. It's crazy. So I've got a letter from the condo corp. They're going to sue me. They're going to take me to court if I don't do something. I better start that N5 process, and I better do a really good N5 appendix, N5 pleadings, talking about my condo rules and bylaws, talking about the Condominiums Act, talking about what the tenant did, talking about the jeopardy it puts me in, because it's not about the fact that he was naked in the hall, it's the fact that he's interfered with my lawful right, interest, privilege, because the condo's coming after me. Think of all conduct evictions the same way. It's not about the thing they do. It's about how it affects the complex. Because if you can't, first of all, plead it in your appendix to the N5, N6, N7, and then prove it at the hearing, you won't get your eviction. Let's talk about illegal acts. Somebody does child porn distribution from their computer, and you see it on the news. He's arrested. So you give him an N6. How are you going to get the eviction? He was on his computer and he did something illegal, but did it have the potential to affect the complex? Now, was he making child porn in his unit? different. There are young children in the complex. That affects the complex. But just because someone's doing tax fraud, for instance, from their unit, won't get you an eviction. It's not the thing they do, it's the consequences of the thing you do. You should think of that every time you do an N567. I have, as you know, the 8 webinars. The one on evictions for conducts. I have 3 or 4 spectacular examples of pleadings for different situations. Condo, smoking, etc. You need to be so good at the LTV that you trap the adjudicator in a room that only has one door, your door. And if he doesn't do it right, you can win an appeal or review. But adjudicators are sometimes, I say sometimes, lazy and hungry for lunch, and they just want to get your case done with. That's where paralegals have value. We know process. We don't let our clients get messed with. You can do it if you're sophisticated, but get the tools and the knowledge, because without that, you're in some trouble. If any of you are going to the board, I do sell these 8 individually. So for instance, if you're going to the board, spend $75 on going to the board and $75 on getting your eviction through mediation of the board. If you're a brand new landlord, buy rent control, starting a tenancy, rights and obligations. There's a package price for them, but I am the best at this in the province. I take my job very seriously when I do these webinars, and because this is the landlord community has supported me since 2005, and to me it matters what I do. So those are the changes, recent changes, and some context of how the LTV works. And I'm happy if there's time to take some questions. Thank you. Thank you. Right in the back.
Yeah, it's a question on student rental, and we get a lot of international students that come in. When you say that now there's the law inside a lease, what happens if they say, no, I don't want to sign anything?
Well, they have to. I mean, if you want to go with signing nothing, if you're happy with signing nothing, you can get away with it, because the law does not say you have to have a lease. But if you try to get them to sign anything that's not the government lease, then you're in trouble. If the tenant finds out about the government lease, and I didn't cover this, and then demands it, a couple of things can happen. After 21 days after the tenancy starts, because they're supposed to have the lease on or before the day the tenancy starts, they can stop paying rent. Now, that's just suspended until they get the lease. Now they make a demand. I want the lease. When 30 days have passed, if you haven't given them the lease, they can cancel their tenancy. They can leave. If you give them the lease finally after the tenancy starts and they don't like what's in the lease, they can cancel their lease. Because remember, you were supposed to give it before the tenancy started. If the 30 days has gone by and you haven't given it to them, they can withhold an entire month's rent. So if you've signed something, it's got to be the government lease. And if you've signed it, you have to give it to them. Yes, sir.
Do you have some form where I can help keep my kid out of the house?
This is your kid who won't get a job, and is he a tenant?
No, he's got a job.
Questions?
Can you say who can live in a unit? So if say you rent something to my husband and I, and then we decided my 18-year-old granddaughter was going to live with us.
Landlords stop thinking about the feudal system where they were lords of the land and had control. They don't. It's a contractual and statutory, meaning the RTA, relationship. You have to start thinking about tenancies as if you've granted the tenants an easement. An easement is a granting of rights for a limited purpose without title. When you rent to a tenant, it's hands off. You can't get judgmental. You can't decide who they love, live with, sleep with, etc. Anybody can bring anybody to live with them, subject to property standards, occupancy bylaws, or if you're in a condo, condominium declarations and rules.
So, my husband and I have student rentals. Our insurance actually, current rent is not like that. Our insurance actually requires us to tell them how many people are renting in the home. Our present lease is 1 tenant per month. We do that for a couple of reasons. Obviously, we're paying all the utilities. And there's always the incidents
Are these separate tenancies in each room, or is it one tenancy?
It's one tenant, they're all under one lease.
Okay, so it's one tenancy.
Individual people in individual rooms.
One tenancy.
Yes, correct. And our insurance company actually made us tell them how many people were renting in the
I
home.
can speak to that. I'm a personal insurance broker with Hub International. So we have to ask that because that's how you're quoted. That's what your premium is based on. It's the liability exposure surrounding how many tenants you have. Plus you fall into different varying degrees of when it's considered a student rental versus multiple
Our insurance
occupancy.
knows, our insurance, we're upfront about it, our insurance knows there's students in it, and they specify certain things like, no occupancy
Right.
are allowed, no rental furnaces, because it's specific to student rentals.
Yeah,
So
so
we're
we're
very
very
upfront.
You have a shared kitchen, shared facilities.
They share the kitchen and bathroom
Yeah.
amongst the students. So it's that's kind of a hard one for us because we are paying all the utilities and our insurance knows that
See, it's no harder for you than if somebody's renting out a whole house and they're paying all the utilities. Landlords get killed when they're paying utilities and they bring in people. But, I mean, right in the standard government lease, it says you can't charge more.
Because it does become a clash between the other students renting it.
I'm sure it does.
So do you
So
do a
it-
lease for each student?
No,
No.
this is one lease.
We've been advised to put everybody on one lease.
Well, there are so many issues with this. For instance, you have them on one lease, but if there's lots on the lease, I'd say it's not one tenancy. If there's 3 people there, but he was there first, he came, she came, he left, she came, he left, it's not one tenancy. Who are you kidding? And at some point, you can get called on it. You might be smarter strategically having it under one lease, but it's bogus. And you might end up one day in a situation where an adjudicator finds that you have tenants in common, not a joint tenancy, because you're probably telling them now, well, if he leaves, you two still need to pay the whole rent.
No.
Okay, and you don't have a joint tenancy. You're doing everything wrong from a legal point of view. It could be everything right from a strategic point of view, but it's not a joint tenancy, and having them on one lease it doesn't really make it so just because it's on the lease.
Open question to the room. How many investors have had a tenant cash their house, cash their rental? 1 out of every 2. That's it? 3? Okay.
We've all had.
5 minutes or less. How do we avoid this? And when it happens, how do we protect ourselves from it?
First of all, when you screen for people that have jobs. You want to be able to garnish money. A week before the tenancy is going to end, assuming they don't do a run in the night, you need to have a maintenance inspection. You should do a move-in inspection, and boy, I can't stress this enough. When tenant moves in, take pictures, lots of pictures. Have the stamp of the date from the camera on your pictures, and have the tenant participate in a move-in checklist. A week before they leave, do a move-out check. You can't force the tenant to show up, but tell the tenant it's in their best interest if they show up for the move-out check, because if there's damage, you're going to be talking to them about it. Once they move out with damage, if they still live there, and you can get a quote quick, and there's $3,000 in damage, and they still live there, you can file a damage application at the LTB right away. You're better off at the LTB because you don't have to worry about finding them, which is an issue in small claims court. If you don't catch them until they're gone, you can't go to the LTB, but you can go to small claims court, but that gets more troublesome. So I'd say pictures, checks a week before, try to file at the LTB while they're still in possession. That means you need like a week before you need to do the inspection. That doesn't mean that you can't amend it if they do damage on the move out. But you want to get the application filed. The board loses jurisdiction to deal with landlord applications, rent damage, once the tenant no longer lives there. As long as you filed while they live there, they keep it. But if you missed it, you're going to small claims court. To go to small claims court to sue him for damage, I have to find him to serve him with a plaintiff's claim. He's not going to tell me where he's going.
That's all great now, but You say screen for
Jobs.
people with jobs, so now human rights Act says you can't discriminate. So you basically,
Well, you can discriminate
You're just-
against looking at their credit. Discriminate just means
you're
choose.
just not giving them a reason. You're just overlooking.
That's a whole, if the Human Rights Code, I could stand here for an hour and talk about it. If you look at my #2 webinar, Starting the Tenancy, I do about a half hour on the Human Rights Code, but you gotta be very careful. It's interesting, and I warn every real estate brokerage about this. Realtors tend to advertise for units on an exclusive, irrevocable basis. So you see the ad, you put in the offer, it's irrevocable, which for let's say, it's exclusive. I won't take any others until I've dealt with you. So stupid, so wrong. And it came from the realtor's paradigm of doing that for purchase and sale. All realtors should stop doing exclusive offers for tenancy. They should do it the way small landlords do, where they take applications and do interviews. Because if you apply, and I'm not looking at anybody else, and I don't like you because whatever, I want to break the law, I want to break the Human Rights Code, and I don't want him, I have to tell him, I'm sorry, sir, we didn't accept you. And then he asks why, and I can't say, well, I prefer another tenant. It's the same way some of these restaurants, like the Keg, they hire hot waitresses. How do they do it? How do they only hire hot waitresses? Because they put an ad in, they get 100 people, and from those 100 applications, they select 3. And they say, you know, sweetie, you're hot, but we just, they say, your application was great, but we just preferred some others. But you can't say that when you use this terrible, dangerous, and I've dealt with realtor brokerage clients who've been sued by the Human Rights Tribunal because they couldn't really explain why they didn't like him, but they couldn't say, well, you know, I'm going to just keep collecting some offers, applications. I'm going to maybe make 3 weeks from now. I'll you know, make that the date. You've got to do that, or you're opening yourself up to terrible Human Rights Tribunal liability.
Does the RTA or the board today provide any assistance to an applicant who feels they've been discriminated against?
No, that's the Human Rights Tribunal.
Right, but there's no.
No, the RTA, with one small exception, the LTB only deals with tenancies once they've started.
Right.
If you rejected them, they go to the Human Rights Tribunal. Okay, if no, last one?
So if you're on your old license, or your old application, you have to go to the
Sorry, say again?
If I'm still running under my old application.
Oh, your old lease.
Lease.
No, old leases are fine.
I can still use that.
You bet.
They haven't moved up.
Yeah, you don't have to go and redo them. It's amazing how many landlords redo leases every year for existing tenants. Don't. I mean, it's crazy. There's no need for it. The tenancy agreement continues to, the lease doesn't end. People say, my lease ends in August. Your lease doesn't end. The lease continues to be binding until the tenancy ends, which could be 5 years from now. You had a question.
I have a single detached rented out. I'm about to be adding 2 units on the back end of it. And I know most municipalities in the city is only going to let me do 1 water meter. They're only going.
Really?
So I can install separate private meters.
Right. You can get a plumber to put in meters.
Right. It's the same thing they have, except they're not interested in facilitating that, which I understand for them it's a pain in the ass. So, like, what are the implications of 5 separate private water meters?
If you have separate meters and you have and who do you pay? The city?
I'd be paying the entire bill
To the
but
city.
I would be facilitating the bills.
Yeah, you really couldn't have them paying the city because they don't know how much they're paying. You'd have to have them reimburse you based on the usage. There's another strategy that some landlords use that I haven't seen challenged, so I don't know if it'll work, to do with utilities. Have a lease that's, if it's all in, if utilities are included, which some are, have it all in, single person rents a house. It's $2,000 inclusive, maximum $500, $300 electricity, $200 water, $100 gas per month. The tenant has to pay everything over that to the landlord. To me, it seems legal. I can't find any reason why not. Remember, the LTB might not deal with it, But at least if the water's running all day, or if they start running a laundromat from their home, you've capped the all-in number for gas, water, and hydro.
Just a follow-up question, like if I have these separate water meters and I give tenant A his bill, tenant B her bill, and they dispute it, could I take that?
Depends on your lease.
If it's in the lease, if that's all disclosed in the lease, can I evict on those grounds?
They're substantially interfering with your lawful right under the tenancy agreement. People get confused about this lawful right business. What is this lawful right? It's a right that's established lawfully. You and I agree there'll be no smoking. So I have the privilege of having you not smoke. You have the obligation not to smoke. It's my right that you don't smoke. It's in our lease. If you smoke, you're interfering with my lawful right. People think of N5s about interference with enjoyment. You're short-selling your skills if you forget about lawful right. So for instance, a tenant decides in a freestanding home to do auto body repair, and on his lawn are transmissions and differentials. The city comes by and fines you. The tenant's not interfering with your enjoyment. He's interfering with your lawful right with respect to having peace with the city. So it's N5. So it's, if you've agreed to something in the lease and it's substantial and the tenant breaches it, then they've substantially interfered with your lawful right, interest, or privilege. Should I make that the last question? I don't know what you do with time here.
Yeah. Is there any other questions?
Two tenants, they go into a lease together.
They go into a bar, two tenants go to a bar.
One of the tenants moves out, personal circumstances. Do we get a new lease with first tenant and a second person?
One of the clauses in my lease that I've been flogging all night says that all tenancies are joint and several. Tenancies are usually joint and several, even without that clause. In law, there's a principle of joint tenants versus tenants in common. In law, there's the four, what do they call them? The four unities that have to exist to have a joint tenancy. Unity of time, interest. Basically, if tenants move in at the same time, they rent the whole house, they sign one lease, they're joint tenants. And that's what you want.
That's what we had, that one moved
If
out.
one moves out, they're still joint tenants. One guy's no longer a tenant, but he's still on the covenant. So there's absolutely no reason to do a new lease, and the guy who's left behind has to pay the full rent. Now, the tenancy, if the guy didn't pay his rent, you couldn't take the guy who left to the LTB, because the LTB says if he's not in possession, even though he's still responsible as a joint tenant, the LTB doesn't want to give it. They say, take him to small claims. So you would only put the one tenant who's there on the N4, but he's responsible for the whole rent. Sometimes a tenant says, let me off the lease. Here's my N9. I say, you can give me this N9, but an N9 can't sever a joint tenancy. It's all for one, one for all. If your buddy wants to leave, 60 days notice, fine, give me an N9 signed by both of you. If he wants to leave, I can't stop him from leaving. You know, he can go wherever he wants, but just so he knows, if you default, I might come after him because he's the one with the good job. So no reason to sign a new lease. Some people from that say, well, what if you ask me if your friend can go on the lease? Well, the person will ask if their friend can go on the lease because they think he can't live there unless he goes on the lease. So I would say as a landlord, let him fill out to give you a credit check and stuff. If he's got money and he wants to become a signatory to the lease, I'm just thrilled. Maybe not. Maybe I'm in a market that's appreciating so much in rental fees. I'm hoping now that your friend moved out, soon you'll move out, so I can jack the rent up. If I put him on the lease and then you leave, and he puts him on the lease and then he leaves, I'll never get a chance to jack the rent up. So you have to make a business decision about whether you want to have somebody sign to add them to the lease. He can live there without anything on the lease.
If the one joint person stays calm, brings in a new joint.
He's not a new joint, he's a roommate.
Okay. So it wouldn't
He's
be
an
a new
occupant.
lease, it wouldn't be a new rent
Correct.
increase. It wouldn't
If
be-
you're interested, read LTB Interpretation Guideline 21 about occupants, roommates, guests, tenants, stuff like that. They wrote Interpretation Guideline. They wrote it a couple years ago because so many people are confused about what is a tenant. Tenant's someone who signed the lease, unless the landlord allowed him to then be a signatory to the lease, or unless the landlord screwed up and started taking rent from him, put him on an N4, put him on an N1, and then he wants to be a tenant, he's a tenant. Landlords should only deal with their tenants. They can be polite to the other people, but unless you want to turn a non-tenant into a tenant, you don't deal with him. Okay, I think I'm done. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Harry, and by all means, sir.
Just getting in the camera.
Yes, perfect. And by all means, if anyone else who has further questions,
I'll stick around for a while.
I'll stick around for a little bit. And so now we're going to wrap up, and now we're going to do our What's New section. So for anyone that has anything they would like to share in terms of opportunities, in terms of stories, anything that they'd like to share, or even just questions that they'd like to share with everyone, this is your time. I guess I will start. As the CEO and managing partner of Elite Property Investments, Inc., currently right now we have about 6 deals on the go, from single-family home fix and flips, triplexes, and commercial units, strip plazas, and office building opportunities. So if there is anyone currently in the market right now that are looking and would like some more information, we do have a process that we'll follow, and I'll be able to answer any questions. And that's pretty much it for myself. Anyone else? Yes. Question for me?
No. I thought you said anybody else. You want me to
Yes.
come there?
If you'd like to come up, yes.
Okay.
Beautiful.
I'm not up here to tell you what I do, so I'm just going to tell you that if anybody's interested, on April the 15th, it's a Sunday evening. I'm a committee member on the Light of Day for Parkinson's, and we're doing a fundraising event at the Seneca Theater downtown Queen Street, Niagara Falls. There's about 45 tickets left, and it's, I was just going to look to tell you what the name of the band was. I'm having a brain hemorrhage here. Anyways, it's, if you go to the Light of Day site, LOD website, and there's about 45 tickets left. And a great event, great cause. So if you're interested in that, it's April 15th. All right, all the money stays locally in the community, and it goes to the Parkinson's clinic we started up at Shaver Hospital. Thanks.
Post it in the Facebook.
Yeah, I will. I think it's already posted now. It's been out a couple times. Thanks.
Is it posted in the Canadian Real Estate Investors
No,
Association?
but I'll post it there.
Okay, post it there as well.
Say the word?
The stage is all yours.
Oh, yay. Okay. Thanks again for letting me speak. My name is Cameron Wilson, independent mortgage agent with Dominion Lending Center's Canuck Mortgage Group. So I had a meeting today with my broker of record. Turns out we have a new lender available that will finance student rentals. So I know that's pretty tough to find out in the market. So if you're interested in contacting me, it's just dominionlendingniagara.ca. Reach out and I'll definitely help you out. Thanks.
Can you post it in the group as well?
For sure.
Information?
Thank you.
Perfect.
I would buy my razor try license, 5 licenses, stuff.
Yeah, my broker of record said they're good. Yeah, just started being a panel, so I'm not going to name the lender right now, but
Would you like to say something? Perfect. Stage is all yours.
Hi, my name is Harry Stinson. We had the opportunity to speak to a smaller group of the group recently. I'm the developer, going to be operator of the Buffalo Grand Hotel in Buffalo, which we're actually turning into 486 little rental units. And each one of those rental units is sold to an investor. And the neat thing about, just to introduce Steve Fitzmaurice is going to be the general manager there. Has a little bit of experience in some little places like the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. So pretty good standard management. But we'd like to invite you to come down. We have a little open house every Saturday, 2 o'clock in the lobby. A little round table, tell you about the hotel, how it operates, give you a little bit of a tour around. The short story on the value of this is a hotel. It's the Wild West of landlord-tenant. There is no landlord-tenant bureau. There is no rental agreement. If they don't cooperate, we turn off the room and they're gone and the security guard takes care of them. We do all the work for you. It's multiple income streams because what we do is we pool the revenue from the entire hotel, which means parking, banquets, everything, even the dirty movies that nobody claims they ever ordered. All that money goes into the pot and it's divided up. We give a 5% fixed return, guaranteed return, plus 50% of the profits at the end of the year. So it's a hands-off investment. Each unit is $100,000, that's it. So again, we'd like to invite you, come down. There's no RSVP needed. We're in the lobby of the hotel every Saturday afternoon, 2 o'clock. Well, actually, it's better if you do call because you just never know. Any questions, we'll be here. So there's Steve, myself, and Lori over there.
Beautiful.
Sorry. Can I say something about Sorry?
Yes, of course you can.
Good evening. My name is Danielle. I live just around the corner here, and like many of you who probably like to go to these types of events, the only other places in the GTA where you can meet groups like this until we came along was Toronto, Vaughan, Richmond Hill, Ajax, Pickering, and Whitby, which is a long drive from here. So a year ago, me and two other fellow investors started a group in Burlington. We meet at the Holiday Inn in Burlington. We just had our 1-year anniversary. You were there, Danielle, you were there. We had almost 200 people. And we start at 7, we usually run till 10. That's the official meeting, but usually around midnight, they have to kick us out of the room because by midnight, there's still 40 people talking. It's a really, really good networking group. So if you want to find out more, or if you want me to send you an invitation to the next event, which is on the 26th, I'll be sitting there for the next 45 minutes. Just bring your card, and I will add you to the list. But it's as Maria and Danielle will tell you, it's a really awesome group. You're going to find some cool investors, good information. It is called the Southern Ontario Real Estate Investing Training Club. It is about training. That's what we do. But the networking is pretty awesome too. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Bring up like the license. My name's Calvin. I've been in the rental business probably about 30 years. They licensed rentals in Thorold, and now it's going to be coming to St. Catharines, and they're going to try to license in September. So everybody's places are going to be. What's happening in Thorold is a lot of people that are investment properties are getting rid of them because the cost of licensing is going to be huge to us. It's not so much the fee per year, but it's the 48 or 49 pages of stuff they want. It's going to cost us $5,000-$10,000 per unit just to what they want. The people on ODS, Canada Pension Welfare, if you have any of them tenants or pensioners, they can't afford the increases in what it's going to cost us to bring these units up to what they want. So anybody that wants to send letters out and try and stop his licensing before it comes through, because it's definitely going to kill most of the people in the rental business. We've already seen where in Thorold places are gone. They say that Salvation Army is full of people now because the people they can't afford the rents. The rent's got to go up. Yeah.
Hey, I just want to ask you a question about that licensing. Do you know if they've gone as far as to say that like a multi-family property cannot be sold without a license? Like from the date that they're bringing it. I know somebody talked about it, but I think not yet. As far as I know, not yet.
It's 5 units and under they're going to license.
Basically handcuffing you to the property.
Yeah. Anybody has 5 units and over is okay. 5 units and under.
4.
5, I believe.
St. Catharines are talking 4.
Yeah, but it was Thorold was 5, I believe.
And they're supposed to model it after 4.
Yeah. So I don't know if they've tweaked it. I see one line at the bottom that says something about Canada Pension, ODS is exempt. I don't know if they're talking about the tenant or if they're talking about.
What is about them? So why don't you have that some sort of form letter? Why doesn't everybody sign it? Right?
We're gonna have to come up with something.
Yeah, no, it's
yeah, and I've encouraged my tenants even to
phone
their workers and tell their workers they're going to be out in the street because I've told them all. I said, you know what? If they go through with this, I'm done. I'm selling all the
Well, it's
property.
gotta be tenant based because nobody cares about the landlord, right? So,
Or government agencies fighting each other, right?
Well, in that regard, Joe back there, he mentioned something which to me was remarkable, where basically because this has been an ongoing thing, and they were fighting this many years ago before it actually was legalized here in Thorold, where they were bringing in the tenants, whereas especially if things are going hush hush, which everything with Thorold was kind of like slipped under the carpet, so it was literally the last minute that we actually found out that this was being implemented. So moving forward, now that the information is present, getting involved in speaking and having that relationship with your tenants and saying, this is what's going to happen. Yes, this is going to affect us initially, but ultimately it's going to be you guys that are going to be paying for the results of this. So having that open communication with your tenants and getting them involved, it would have a really big impact in them, moving forward with the St. Catherine's area. So for those of you that are, once again, that is affecting that below the 5 units and below that have, so start talking to your tenants, get them involved, and when it comes to Maria's on top of this, so she'll be posting, the next meetings, whenever the meetings are happening, let's get the tenants involved, and, as opposed to it being, how many were there, about 50 landlords in November, let's get a few hundred people there and rallying and supporting and saying, look, you know what, it's not just about the landlords, now it's affecting us.
but it's still hush hush in St. Catharines as well, because
It is.
just a call today to the city of St. Catharines, to the zoning and to different departments acquiring about the property that but we're asking them questions about the new licensing. They have no idea what that is. They don't. What are you talking about?
Keep in mind that it may not be at that level. It's coming from top down.
No, but the problem is though, is if you look at it's on their own website, the city's own website. And if you look and it says it's opening up to public opinion and public discussion in March. Well, March is over in a couple of days, and the city workers, departments have not even heard about it yet. So that tells me that, as you're saying, all of a sudden it's out from the
gonna
carpet.
actually
This
Thorold.
is bullshit. We got to do something.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I urge everybody to tell their tenants, because I know mine can't afford the increases in rent.
Well, the thing is, and I think the key is that if we're all landlords here, nobody really cares about us.
That's right,
Because
they don't care
everybody
about
thinks
us.
we're big, rich public. The thing is that when we put the focus onto the tenants, that everything's going to be passed on to the tenants. Same as the minimum wage thing, everyone's understanding
That's
that now. Only then. will
Yeah,
we be
I've
able
told
to
my
get some-
tenants to
We
slow
can't
their
cry that we're going to increase that. Nobody cares.
That's right.
It has to be the tenants, and we have to get more tenants.
Yeah, your tenants have to phone their workers
It has
and
to
start training.
be somehow organized.
Yeah, well, that's why I'm letting everybody know
Yeah.
before we get into what happened in Thorold.
Okay, well, is everybody here on Facebook? I like to say yes, most people are.
I'm not.
Okay, is everyone part of the Canadian Real Estate Investors Association, Maria's group? Yes, most people. And okay, anyone here not part of the group? Okay. I would suggest being part of that group because, like I said, Maria is on top of that. She's been battling even from when it was back in Hamilton when they were fighting this. So she has all that information. Come here and you know what? I'll take your information and I'll add you to the group myself. And you'll definitely be informed that way, being part of that group because she is continuously posting information in that regard.
So, real quick, if anyone has vacancies in any of their main floor units, either in St. Catharines or the Falls, don't feel obligated to just hit the Kijijis. Why don't we start like a referral group within? And if you have a bad tenancy, somehow, some way we should have a cumulative list that we can all sort of share and say, hey, I saw a few people posting in the group that were saying, hey, is John Doe, anybody has had an experience with John Doe before? And it's good to share within the community. But I do have 2 people looking right now. If anybody has main floor rental in the Falls or St. Catharines, 1,400 or lower, all-inclusive preferred, please hit me up at the back. If if anybody's looking for commercial properties, I'm a commercial realtor. Hit me up at the back after.
Maybe I'm the last one. My name's Curtis. Just came here today. This is pretty cool. I'm not sure if anyone's aware, but the city of Niagara Falls had a council meeting 2 days ago, and they're about to do an official plan and zoning amendment to allow for accessory apartments and all of their things, as per the province is saying. The councillors are really insistent on making sure they're owner occupied, which is a huge thing, and even though the city's lawyer advised them against it, they're pursuing it, so go after their council and start telling them that's a terrible idea. Also, I'm a planner for municipality in Niagara, not St. Kitts or Thorold. So if you guys have any questions, I'm happy. I'm pretty approachable. Just ask me if you have any zoning questions. Do we present deals?
Yes,
No.
I do. Yes, you can.
I just got my zoning approval on a property in St. Catharines, so I need 6 figures, 8% interest rate over 3 months annualized. So let me know.
All right. All right. So I guess right now, for anyone that has any other questions, we could break out into the various groups once again, Airbnbs, or if there's any information that anybody has based off of the people that came up and shared. You could, connect, network, and any questions, we're here. For those that want to be part of the Canadian Real Estate Investors Association, I could add you to the group. Just come here. I'm sure everybody did sign in. I take it. Did anybody not sign in? Nope. Perfect. And I guess that wraps everything up for the night. And any other questions? We're here to help. And once again, any questions, post to the groups.